First, I would like to give you a brief overview of how the American Revolution is conducted and give you a sense of what some of the more important turning points are in this conflict. First of all, in 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets and they take a couple of very crucial actions that will have important consequences for how this war will be fought. It is the Second Continental Congress that raises the Continental Army. This is an army that consists of volunteers from all 13 colonies. And crucially, they make the decision to appoint George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of this Continental Army. This is important because remember, most of the action at this point had taken place in New England. Boston and the immediate area around Boston had been the center of a lot of conflict between the British and the American colonists. Washington is a Southerner. He's from Virginia. He had been in the Virginia militia. He had fought with the British during the French and Indian War in the 1750s. So by putting Washington in command of the Continental Army, the Continental Congress is sending a very deliberate message that this is a conflict that will have wide support all across the colonies. In other words, Washington's a Southerner. He has deep experience within the colonial militias. He brings a sort of outsider's perspective into the Continental Army. The other thing the Continental Congress does is they issue about $2 million worth of paper money in order to pay for the conflict. Now, it's important that you understand this money is issued with nothing to back it. In other words, there's no gold, there's no silver to really back it. So this money very quickly becomes worthless, and it leads to very rampant inflation that will take place during the Revolutionary War. Remember that because I'll circle back around to that and talk about it when we get to the end of the Revolutionary War and the consequences that that decision had. In 1776, in January of 76, Thomas Paine, who was an Englishman who had resettled into the American colonies at the beginning of this conflict, he publishes a pamphlet titled Common Sense. And in this pamphlet, he attacked the very idea of monarchy, and he attacked the very idea that some men were born to rule and others were born to be ruled. In this pamphlet, he encourages Americans to break away. And this pamphlet has an enormous impact on the revolutionary movement. Within just a couple of weeks, more than 150,000 copies of this pamphlet were sold. Now, that would be astronomical sales in today, in the 21st century. For the 18th century, for any book or pamphlet to sell 150,000 copies in just a few weeks was nothing short of extraordinary. So this was widely read, and remember, one of Paine's main arguments was that the idea of a natural hierarchy, that some people are born to rule and others are born to be ruled, he says that idea is ridiculous. So that's going to have a major impact on American thinking during this conflict, but also in the years after the conflict when the Americans are trying to establish a new form of government. The first few years of the war, between 1775 to 76, most of the conflict is centered right here in and around New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies. The Battle of Bunker Hill takes place in Boston Harbor, and it is the first official conflict of the war. What I would want you to know about the first few years of this war is that things do not go well for the American colonists in the beginning. After Bunker Hill is captured by British soldiers, all of Boston and most of New England falls into the British militia's hands. Shortly after that, New York is evacuated by the Patriots, and the British take control over New York. And in December of 1776, there's a very important symbolic victory at the Battle of Trenton. This is not a strategically important battle, but it's a victory in which George Washington very surprisingly crossed the Delaware River in the middle of winter and attacked British troops stationed at Trenton in New Jersey. And because this was a surprise attack, it's a victory for the Patriots. It's not strategically important, but it was a big moral victory, and Washington knew that this was a victory that would encourage Americans to continue on with this conflict. So in essence, the first couple of years of this war see a lot of British victories and a lot of American defeats, but this first period of the war ends with the Battle of Trenton, which is a kind of moral victory for American colonists. One major problem for the British in this conflict is that they don't seem to have any clear strategy for what victory would look like. In other words, the British are overwhelmingly the favorites to win this conflict. They have a powerful military, they have a paid professional army, they have the world's most powerful navy at the time, they have a worldwide empire, they are a force to be reckoned with. The colonists, on the other hand, have none of that. They have the Continental Army, but it is made up of militiamen. They're not paid professional soldiers like the British have. And also, Americans do not have the same resources that the British Empire has. But the British are in a position to where they're having to fight this conflict over a vast amount of difference. 2,000 miles separates the North American colonists from Britain. So there's no clear purpose, there's no clear idea about what victory would look like. And they know that they want to restore the old colonial governments. They know they want to turn back the clock and go back to a time before the revolution broke out. They don't necessarily want to completely devastate the country because they want to get the system working again the way it was before the conflict broke out. In the early years of the war, they made the plan that they were going to cut off New England because New England was the hotbed of revolution. It was the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, all of the early conflicts came out of New England. So the British thought if we cut off New England and separate them from the rest of the colonists, then the other colonies will fall into line and then we'll punish New England. But there are a couple of crucial turning points in this conflict with the British. The first major turning point is the Battle of Saratoga, which takes place in 1777. This is in upstate New York, and this battle is a stunning American victory against the British Army. And basically, the Battle of Saratoga convinces the French that American colonists could possibly win this war. And they get involved. The French agree to get involved and supply crucial support to the American rebels after the Battle of Saratoga. Now remember, the French are not necessarily doing this out of any sort of agreement that they have with the American cause. The French are still very bitter about their loss to the British during the French and Indian War. So they're doing this more for revenge against the British than any other purpose. So the French get involved after the Battle of Saratoga. When that happens, the British make the decision to not focus so much on New England, but basically to focus more on the South. And they adopt what becomes the Southern strategy, which will guarantee that the last few battles of the war, the last few major important battles of the war, will be fought in the Southern colonies between 1778 and 1780. As we'll discuss, the Southern strategy entailed a racial strategy as well. In other words, the British Army would attempt to use Southern slaves against the colonists during this conflict, and because of the racial dynamics of the South, that leads to very serious consequences for how this conflict would be played out. The final battle of the final major battle of the conflict is the Battle of Yorktown, which takes place in Virginia in 1781. This is, again, another stunning American victory. It was a victory for Americans because they worked in conjunction with French soldiers and with the French Navy to basically corner the British general, whose name was Lord Cornwallis, and cornered him in Virginia, forced him to surrender his entire army to George Washington. And after the Battle of Yorktown, the British sort of give up on this conflict. They agree that it's best to just let the Americans, to make peace with the Americans, to grant them their independence. And so the Treaty of Paris will be signed in 1783, 2 years after Yorktown. But that 2-year time period, there's no major battles that are fought. There's basically negotiating between the two sides about what peace would look like. So the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, and this is the treaty that ends the American Revolution. In this treaty, the British agree to do a couple of things. First off, and most importantly, all 13 colonies are granted their independence from the British. So for the first time in history, a colonial people have rose up in rebellion against the mother country and have been granted their independence as a result of that rebellion. They also, remember, most of the colonies extended to the Appalachian Mountains, which is this area right here. So this area was the area of settlement by 1783. The British decide to grant all of the land east of the Mississippi River to the new American nation. So, in other words, all of this land from this area over is granted to the new American nation. This is important because remember, this is what we have referred to as the middle ground, and this area is not empty. There's a very large Native American population living in this area. So the British give this land to the American colonists because they don't want to deal with the native tribes that are there, which means that soon after independence, the American nation is going to have to decide these people living in this area, the Native Americans living in this area, are they citizens or are they not? Are they part of us or are they something separate? In addition to that, in exchange for getting their independence and getting all of the land east of the Mississippi River, Americans promised to repay all of the debt that they had gone into to British merchants. So all of that commercial exchange that was taking place prior to the Revolution created a lot of debt among American colonists. The American colonists promised that even though they're no longer part of the British Empire, they promised that they would pay that debt. That's an important sticking point because Americans will never pay that debt, and that becomes a major conflict between the British and Americans in the early years of the 19th century, and will be used partly to justify a new conflict in the War of 1812. Now I want to talk about how three specific groups are affected by the American Revolution. And the first group that I want to talk about is American women and their participation in the American Revolution. First off, you'll remember that women are already politically active during this time period by forming organizations such as the Daughters of Liberty. And the Daughters of Liberty, you'll remember, is a group that was put together to boycott British-made goods in the lead-up to the American Revolution. One of the more famous or infamous actions that American women took in the lead-up to the American Revolution was the signing of something called the Eatonton Agreements, or the Eatonton Accord. This was signed by a group of women in October of 1774 in Eatonton, North Carolina. It is signed by a group of about 51 women, and in this declaration, it's basically a declaration where these women say, we will not buy any British-made goods that are taxed. Any of these illegal taxes that the British are trying to impose on these goods, we will boycott those goods. Through the course of signing this petition, they make the statement that they say we are determined to give memorable proof of our patriotism. So in other words, you start to see women take a political stance and be granted a kind of political role because of their roles as the economic gatekeepers to the household. In other words, it was women who were in charge of buying the tea, buying the sugar, buying the fabric that was then used to support the family. So because of that, because of their roles as consumers, women found themselves politicized because those consumer items were taxed. What you're seeing in this cartoon here, in this slide, is a political cartoon that appeared in a British newspaper after the Eatonton Agreements are signed. And here you see the British are sending a couple of messages about women's role in politics. First, so what these women are doing, what the center of action is in this cartoon, is these women in Eatonton, North Carolina are signing the Eatonton Agreements. You'll notice a couple of things. This is a chaotic situation. This woman here, who is sort of the center of your attention, she is engaging in some sort of illicit sexual activity with the guy that you see in this picture. That's obviously sending the signal that a woman who would step outside of her gender boundaries by engaging in politics is a sexually loose woman. You'll also notice this woman right here. She is not particularly attractive. And the British are sending the message that a woman who would engage in politics is unfemale, she is unattractive, she is unsexing herself. You'll see here there's a child that's left to his own devices, and there's a dog who is biting on this child's ear. Obviously, the message that's being sent in this political cartoon is that women are forsaking their roles as caretakers of the home and caretakers of children in order to engage in politics. The last thing I'll point out about this cartoon that's interesting is this woman right here. This is an African American woman, obviously a slave, who is looking over the shoulders of these white women who are engaging in political activities, who are declaring their independence. And the subliminal message that's being sent here is, if you let women start to take greater role in politics, it's only a matter of time before African Americans will do the same thing. It's only a matter of time before black women start taking on political roles and demanding maybe their freedom in the future. So this political cartoon is meant to highlight how dangerous some people thought political activity was for women in the 18th century. One woman who definitely did not fear women's political activities was Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who will later become the first vice president and the second president of the United States, but who during the Revolution was a member of the Second Continental Congress. Adams very famously wrote a letter to her husband in which she basically said that when this conflict is over, I would desire that you remember the ladies and be kinder to women than your predecessors have been. And she goes on to make the argument that this conflict is unique, that never before have a group of people thrown off a monarch and established a new government. And she basically said we need to rethink the traditional rights and roles that are given to women in a republic. But for all of her writing to John Adams and for all of her vocalizing the idea that women should have new rights and new privileges in the new nation, that doesn't really come to fore. The legal status that governs women in the colonial period is called femme covert. This is also referred to as the law of coverture. This basically means that once a woman gets married, she ceases to have any legal identity independent from that of her husband. What this means in reality is that a woman cannot own property separately from her husband. If she owned property before she got married, well, once she gets married, that property is subsumed under the husband's legal identity. She cannot sign contracts because it's the husband who has legal power to sign contracts. She cannot, if there's a divorce that occurs, she cannot get custody of her children because her legal identity is completely subsumed under that of her husband. This law is not changed. That's the law that governs British women and American colonial women in the 18th century. After the Revolution, the law of coverture gets written into American laws, and it doesn't really change for them. So basically, the American Revolution politicizes women in ways that they had never been politicized before. You see them boycotting British goods. You see them signing petitions. You see women like Abigail Adams saying, let's rethink what rights and privileges we give to women. But the reality is that nothing really changes for them. The law that covers them, that creates legal disabilities for women, is never rethought. It's never changed, and it gets written into the new laws of the American nation. In this slide, you're seeing a picture of Joseph Brant, who was a mixed racial and interracial man. His mother was a Native American woman, and his father was a white man. And his fate and his role in the American Revolution demonstrates the impact that the American Revolution had on Native American groups. Most Native American tribes sided with the British, and this makes sense if you think about it, because prior to the American Revolution, there had been a lot of conflict between American colonists and Native American groups over access to land and to territory in the West. So when this conflict breaks out, many Native American groups decide that their best interest is to serve with the British, so that when this war is over, they will be able to have the British side with them in their conflicts over land with the American colonists. Of course, you know the American Revolution ends with an American victory. So what this means is that many Native Americans, like Joseph Brant, who sided with the British, are in the position of being on the wrong side. No mention is made in the Treaty of Paris of Native American groups. In other words, the British, even though their allies were the Native Americans during this conflict, they make no mention of these native groups in the Treaty of Paris. So what this means is that American colonists see a lot of native groups as being the enemies. They fought against Americans during this conflict, and therefore they will be excluded from the American state. They will be defined as outsiders, and basically they will be dealt with as foreign nations after the conflict. As a matter of fact, the American Revolution ends, the last battle is fought in 1781, but Native American groups continue to fight against American colonists until well into the 1790s. Basically, what will happen, because the final battle of the American Revolution is not the final battle for Native Americans, what will have to happen is a series of new treaties will have to be signed between the native groups and the new American nation to end the conflict between Indians and Americans. Two of these treaties are particularly important because they demonstrate the American attitude towards native groups in the 1780s, at the very beginning of American nationhood. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix is signed in 1784, so the year after the Treaty of Paris is signed, and it's a treaty between the Iroquois Indians in New York and the American nation. And the Treaty of Fort Finney is signed in 1786 between the Shawnee Indians in Ohio and the new American nation. Both of these treaties demonstrate that Americans are not going to give citizenship and they're not going to give political rights to Native Americans because they are defined as enemies, as outsiders to the American state. In both of these treaties, both the Iroquois and the Shawnee are required to give up land in the east and basically agree to move westward. This establishes a very important precedent because in the initial years, a lot of Americans just want Native Americans out of their area of settlement. In other words, move them beyond the line of settlement, require them to move westward so that the two do not have to intermingle and intermix. That's important because what you should see here is that Native Americans do not get access to citizenship, they do not get access to rights or benefits under the American state. They're just required to move beyond the border of settlement and basically get out of the way. Okay, you know from our previous discussions that American slavery had been ingrained within the American colonies for about a century and a half prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution. In the 70 or 80 years before the Revolution is fought, you know that the population, the African American population of the colonies, is growing at an enormous rate. And so the American Revolution will have a very particular impact on this important group of people in the American South. Initially, African Americans had not been allowed to fight in the Continental Army. The idea of arming slaves, of giving slaves guns and teaching them how to fight, was a very radical idea to a lot of plantation owners. And remember, George Washington, in addition to being a colonel in the Virginia militia, in addition to being a surveyor and all of that other stuff, he was also a slave owner, a plantation owner as well. So he was not very open to the idea of African Americans serving in the Continental Army. Towards the end of the conflict, as the American Continental Army got more desperate, they did agree to allow slaves to fight in the Continental Army, but only if they had their master's permission. The slaves had to demonstrate that they had their master's permission in order to fight. Now, that gets me to a larger point, which is that African Americans fought in this conflict, and they fought on both sides. They fought on the American side, and they fought on the British side as well. However, most African Americans will fight on the side of the British because you'll remember that the British had been making a concerted effort to use African American slaves against white American colonists. You'll remember from our discussions of Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment that this was a characteristic of the war from its earliest times. Well, when the Southern Strategy was adopted in 1779, the British issue a second proclamation, which is called the Philipsburg Proclamation, which said that in the South, all slaves would be free, not just those who fought with the British. Remember, Lord Dunmore offered freedom to any slave who fought on the side of the British. Well, in 1779, they go a step further and they say, you know what, we're just going to end slavery in all the American colonies, not just for the slaves that are fighting with us. Now, the problem with this proclamation is that it's really not enforceable. The British cannot enforce this proclamation if they don't have control over the territory that they're trying to govern. However, it does serve to do something. It creates divisions between whites and blacks in the South. African Americans begin to see that fighting on the side of the British is a route to get their freedom, whereas whites in the South, who had not been united in the conflict against the British, become united, and they become to see that it's in their best interest to have racial unity in the South and to make sure that the British do not win in order to make sure that slavery will survive beyond the American Revolution. Now, even though a lot of slaves do not get their freedom as a result of this conflict, there is a very important development in which some people begin to question whether or not slavery is fit for a republic. The guy you're seeing here in this slide is one of the people who first begins to question the appropriateness of slavery. This is Prince Hall. Prince Hall was a slave in Massachusetts who eventually bought his freedom from his master, and so he was a free black by the time the American Revolution began. He becomes very concerned with the place of African Americans in the new United States after the war is over. He and another small group of free blacks in Massachusetts circulate a petition that is designed. They petition the Massachusetts state legislature to end slavery in Massachusetts. This petition is not successful, but very soon after the war, in the 1780s, the state of Massachusetts will become the first state to abolish slavery. So you do have African Americans themselves begin to question slavery, to politically organize, to send petitions to state legislatures asking for the end of slavery. So that is a positive benefit to the war, to African Americans as a result of the American Revolution. You also have people like Anthony Bennasset who get involved in this conflict, who get involved in this debate about slavery. Bennasset was a white Quaker from Pennsylvania, and he begins to say that slavery is immoral and that it needs to be immediately abolished for moral reasons. Now, he is considered, both Prince Hall and Anthony Bennasset, in the 1770s and the 1780s, both of these men are considered to be radicals for their time period. In other words, very few people are questioning slavery. Very few people are willing to say that it is immoral to hold slaves. However, it's important that you see what is radical in the 1780s and the 1790s will not be radical about 30 or 40 years later. In other words, what is being developed here is a very important idea, which is that slavery and democratic society are not compatible. A lot of that has its roots in the American Revolution, and those roots will begin to grow and to create new conflict in the new American nation in the early 19th century. All right, so you've heard this lecture on the American Revolution, and I just want to recap for you what some of the major points are that you need to get out of hearing this lecture. First off, you should get an overview of the strategy that was involved in fighting this conflict, the actions of the British and the actions of the Continental Congress and of the Continental Army that had an important impact on how this war was fought. But then the major thing I want you to get out of this lecture is an understanding of what groups benefited within American society and what groups did not benefit within American society in regards to fighting this war. In other words, if you're asking the question, who was this revolution a revolution for, whose world was being drastically changed as a result of that revolution, you need to look at the different gender and racial impacts that this revolution had on different groups. We spent time talking about women, Native Americans, and African Americans, and go back and look through your notes and be able to talk about what things politicized these groups and how did that politicalization play out during the Revolution and the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. If you can see those things, then you begin to understand that some groups got limited benefits. Women were being politicized, African Americans were being politicized, but they don't get the full promise of the Revolution, which is that all men are created equal. So that liberty and equality that we think of as being associated with the American Revolution does not apply to those three major groups. Having said that, it does apply to some groups within American society, and in the next lecture that you'll hear, we'll begin to talk about who does get liberty and equality as a result of this revolution. All right? Thank you.